We always enjoy the conversation and learn a ton when we bring on Brian Driscoll from Irish Breakdown to talk Notre Dame football with us. It's always a good time. Brian, how you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing great, Mark. Thanks for having me on. It's been too long. It's been too long. I'm sorry that
Absolutely.
I know you've tried to connect here and get going, but it's been a crazy couple months.
Hey,
But I'm
Brian, I know
excited to be
you've
on
got a
with you.
ton going on both personally and professionally. Just know that you are always welcome
I
here. We would
appreciate
take
that.
you as much as we can get you. So
I
we
appreciate
we
that.
enjoyed the conversation, of course. Spring football underway in South Bend. You brought up the name Al Golden, of course,
Mhm.
former Miami and Temple head coach, taking over the Notre Dame defense. Marcus Freeman, of course, being defensive oriented. Your thoughts about how that will work and what Golden had to say in his introductory news conference.
Yeah, we've now had a chance to speak with Coach Golden twice, and it's been very interesting. His first press conference, he talked a lot about Coach Freeman and just how Coach Freeman was so influential in getting him here, and I thought that was smart, and it showed a savvy veteran coach. I mean, there can be some. I mean, Mark, you've been in this business a long time, right? Like a 51-year-old coach who's been a head coach for 10 years and was at Miami and has had the success he's had working for a 36-year-old first-time head coach. With some coaches, that older coach, that could be a problem. And I thought that Al Golden was really masterful in how he approached that first press conference of, just sort of, hey, you're the head coach, and letting people know that he had that mentality. And then Coach Freeman and Coach Golden have both been adamant that, like, this isn't Marcus Freeman's defense. This isn't Al Golden's defense. And Al Golden said today, this is our defense, right? Like, this is me. It's the assistants. It's the players, especially the players. And so I think they're trying to kind of squash a lot of the how do I say this? The drama that maybe is created on outside the program about that type of relationship, because we don't have a lot else, I guess, to talk about. Some people try to take, and create something that maybe isn't there. And I thought that they really handled that well. And he talked about how they're going to continue to be a more aggressive defense and be more of an attacking defense and what they're doing to get to that point. And not a lot of specifics from him or from Marcus Freeman or really anybody else we've talked to. Tommy Reese is about the most open guy that Notre Dame has right now as far as getting into particulars, but they're 4 practices in. So honestly, they haven't even gone full pad yet. So if they were saying a lot of things, I don't know how much I would, read into it when they haven't put full pads on just yet.
When you look at the defense coming into 2022, I would think that Brandon Joseph, the Northwestern transfer, would be a huge part of that. When you look at the overall numbers through the transfer portal, Brian, there could be some surface perspective that it was more of subtraction than addition. There's certainly from a quantity standpoint, but how do you look at the way the team and Marcus Freeman's handling the transfer portal, the additions versus the subtractions for 22?
Well, a lot of the subtractions sort of in this offseason have been necessary. I think Notre Dame's just recently got down to 85 scholarships, when you look at the numbers, because they took a full class and tried to take even more. They just missed out on a couple of receivers down the stretch. But, I think that in a lot of ways, this is about sort of Marcus Freeman establishing what his program is going to look like. And when you look at the transfer portal, a lot of Notre Dame fans want Notre Dame to just kind of dive in head first and be like USC and take 15 players. And the reality is, what people have to understand is, Mark, I've been on this show before talking about how there's a lot of excuses about how tough it is academic. And I said, I don't buy a lot of that, because I know what the admission standards are, and they're not as tough as they were, 15, 20 years ago. Where that is true is the undergraduate process. It is incredibly difficult for Notre Dame to get an undergraduate transfer. And, the only 2 they've landed that I can remember in recent seasons were Alohi Gilman, who came from the Naval Academy, and then Brandon Joseph, who came from Northwestern, because it's not the admissions department. It's each department on campus. So the history department or whatever, those chairs determine what will and won't transfer from other schools, and they just don't accept a lot. So if you're an older player, you transfer to Notre Dame as a junior, and they don't accept half your credits, you're not going to be able to do that. And so it's been a challenge. We were told by a source at Notre Dame that the baseball team couldn't get a kid from Harvard as an undergraduate transfer. So it's a little nuts, and Notre Dame's going to have to address that. But So what we've seen Notre Dame do is find the occasional guy like Brandon Joseph, but still continue to focus on the grad transfer, because grad transfer is a different deal. I mean, you're starting, it's almost like freshman enrollee. You've completed your program. Can you get into this particular program? It's not about credits and all that other stuff. And we've seen Notre Dame be successful with the grad transfer program. Obviously, Jack Cohn this past year, going all the way back to Cody Riggs, if you remember when Cody Riggs transferred from Florida. So they've had more success there. Ben Skoranek, 2 seasons ago. That's kind of where, if Notre Dame is going to have help, Nick McLeod is another one. If they're going to get help in the transfer portal, it's going to be the grad transfer portal more often than not, unless you can find a Brandon Joseph from Northwestern, or a kid from Stanford, or if Duke has a kid, maybe that can come. But other than that, it's going to be the grad transfer portal where Notre Dame has their success.
Talking Notre Dame football, Brian Driscoll's here to do the work. Catch him on Irish Breakdown, of course, whether you like Notre Dame or not. If you love college football, it's a must. So get on over to Irish Breakdown and check out Brian's content right there. Before we possibly move on to the defense, as you mentioned before we started to record, recruiting's in a lull for just about everybody right now. Brian Kelly has certainly upped the ante and left a full cupboard for Marcus Freeman and staff, 7th-rated recruiting class in 2022 that, of course, Marcus Freeman was able to maintain. But looking at what's upcoming, everybody wants to know about Dante Moore. Carnell Tate listed Notre Dame in his top 5, which is loaded with blue bloods. What's on the horizon?
Well, real quick, Marcus Freeman had a big role in that number 7 ranked recruiting class. I mean, it was driven by the defense, and he put that class together. But I have to get that little dig at Brian Kelly there. I just can't help myself. But look, it's closing time for Notre Dame, right? And there's a lot of players like a Dante Moore, like Cardinal Tate. Braylon James, who's a top 100 receiver from Texas, visited Notre Dame this past week as well. They had 5-star athlete Samuel Mpemba on campus this past weekend. They had Jaden Osbury, which I love this. Baton Rouge native Jaden Osbury was on campus for his 2nd visit this past week. Notre Dame did a great job with him. And a couple of those guys are like Braylon James is I think he's a 4.2 student, and was looking at Stanford and Notre Dame. Happens to also be really talented football player. Jaden Osbury is a very good student, which is why he's now made 2 trips to Notre Dame on his own dime, talking about coming back for the Blue Gold game. So Notre Dame's in a great position with all those guys. Jason Moore from Maryland, they're in a great position with, from DeMatha. Christian Gray is a kid it's a Notre Dame, LSU, Ohio State battle. There's a lot of players on the board, but for Notre Dame, it's like, okay, this is all great, but you got to close now, right? And I think it all starts at quarterback. I think that's going to be the key, is closing on Dante Moore. Obviously Michigan's trying to get him, Michigan State, Miami, Texas A&M recently offered. He's visited Florida recently. I mean, he's been to LSU. He's been all over the country. Notre Dame's got to close, right? And they've been in great shape with him for a long time. Dante's another one of those, those kids that supposedly didn't exist, during the Brian Kelly tenure, these top 50 5-star kids that also are great students. He's a 4.0 student. And, so it's about everything about Dante screams Notre Dame, but Notre Dame's got to make sure that they can convince Dante of that as well. And I think they've done a good job so far. It's just closing time, right? And that's going to be the key. And, they're hoping to get him on campus by the end of March. He's kind of gone all over the country, and Notre Dame is supposed to be kind of like his last stop. And Notre Dame's going to, try to get that push, because I think he'll announce a decision by the end of April. I think that's kind of what I'm hearing, is the game plan is going to be no later than the end of April. So you're getting into that crunch time. And if you get Dante Moore, then that gives you a much better shot at getting Carnell Tate. All of a sudden now Charles Jagasaw and Monroe Freeling, who are 2 of the best offensive linemen in the country that Notre Dame is looking at, they're trying to get Monroe Freeling out of South Carolina, right? Like, it's going to be a lot easier to do that if you have a 5-star quarterback in the class. You're trying to get Rodney Gallagher out of Pennsylvania, who's a dynamic player that Notre Dame loves. It's a lot easier to do that when you've got a 5-star quarterback, right? And so I think that's going to be the key, is Dante Moore is that domino that makes everything else kind of fall in place. They're going to have a top 10 class this year. There's no question, unless they just lose half the class they have right now. But is it going to be 7 to 9 to 10 like it's kind of been for years? Or can you finally sort of tear down that wall and say, we're going to have that number 1 or number 2 class? That's going to be, in my opinion, determined by their ability to close out on Dante Moore. If they can do that, I think the dominoes start to fall. If they don't, then it'll be a typical Notre Dame class that's pretty good, but not to the level of Bama, Georgia, Ohio State, and programs like that.
Brian Driscoll here talking Notre Dame football. He does it better than anyone. Check him out on Irish Breakdown. Great content. If you love college football, again, even non-Notre Dame fans, get on over there to Irish Breakdown. Defensive front for the Irish. I'm going to leave it wide open because I have no idea what's going on there. So you tell us where the Irish stand as we just are starting spring practice.
Well, their two best defensive linemen returning are Jason Adamiola and Isaiah Foskey. Getting them to turn down the NFL was huge for Notre Dame. And Isaiah Foskey's going to be a little bit limited this spring as he kind of cleans up some offseason stuff. Jason Adamiola is not going to participate this spring. He had a shoulder that was cleaned up, and they just wanted to kind of get that stuff done immediately so that way they could kind of go out and get him healthy and get him ready for the fall. So you're going to see a lot of young guys kind of battling to be part of the rotation. Then, of course, you've got a ballot nose tackle to replace Kurt Hinish, who, was never a sexy player, was never a guy. He was a, two-time captain, but was never a guy that you looked at and said, oh, boy, he's just such a huge part of the defense. But then when you look at how they looked last year in games where he wasn't in, they weren't the same defense, right? So now he's gone. He played – set a Notre Dame record for games played because he actually played 4 years and never had a red shirt, played as a freshman in 2017, but then he took advantage of the COVID year and played a fifth year. So, I mean, it wasn't like, he was a typical fifth-year senior and had a good year this year when he was healthy, and that's going to be an important piece of this. I mean, if you know this, Mark, if you're not good up the middle, then you're just not going to be a great defense. And so, Howard Cross and Jacob Lacey and perhaps Gabriel Rubio are guys that are in contention. And then another young man that was in contention, Aiden Kaneana, who's their only 300-pound defensive lineman, he tore his ACL in the first practice. So he's out of the conversation. So there's a lot of question marks. Is Riley Mills going to stay at 3 technique? Is he going to play big end? Is Justin Adamiola, the Jason's twin brother, going to stay at Viper as a rotation guy and then move around in the third down package? Or maybe he going to move to big end? So there's a lot of question marks and a lot of uncertainty because your dudes are out. And like I said, Foskey's going to be out there, but he's going to be limited, and Adamiola's out. But it's also an opportunity because, look, Jason Adamiola's a fifth-year guy. He's another guy that is taking advantage of the COVID year. He played 4 years, so he's taking advantage of the COVID year. You know who he is, right? Like, there's parts of his game that have to get better and all that, but you know what he is. You know what he can do. What you don't know is, well, what about what's behind him? So this is an opportunity for those young guys to kind of step up and seize that opportunity. And, it's going to largely determine just how good Notre Dame's line is this year. Because in college football today, Mark, you know that you can't have a great line just because your front four is good. You got to be able to run a rotation through there where you're not having a big drop off when you go from year 1 to year 2. And that's what's hurt Notre Dame in the past. I mean, you go back all the way back to the 2012 D-line. Great starters. You had Stephon Tuitt, Lewis Nix, Capron Lewis Moore, all NFL players. But then after that, it was Sheldon Day as a true freshman who was undersized. You had Tony Springman, you had Kona Schwenke, the late Kona Schwenke. There was a big drop-off between that first and second D-line. 2015, they also had a great D-line as far as talent-wise. You had Isaac Rochelle, who got drafted. You had Sheldon Day. You had Jerry Tillery, who was a first-round draft pick. You had Romeo Aguara, who went undrafted, and he's probably been the best pro of all of them, other than Stephon Tuitt. But after that, huge drop-off. And so they've got to be able to establish depth at that position if they're going to really go out and compete with the Ohio States, the Clemsons, and then if you get into the postseason, the Georgias and the Alabamas, they've got to have a really good production up front, and I think that's a big thing too, is getting more production from people not named Foskey and the Adamiolas. Those are going to be the big keys, but there's good players there. It's just about who's going to step up. As Alexander Ehrensberger, who's from Germany, who's a 6'7", 250-pound, really twitchy athlete, but he's still learning the game of football, right? Does he take that leap? Does Nano Safa-Mensah go from being just a nice, eat up some reps, strong kid in the end? Does he become more of a difference maker at defensive end? Can Riley Mills turn his, flashes of talent as a sophomore and flashes of production as a sophomore into him being a big time player? There's so many question marks, but that's kind of the theme, right? That we've talked a lot about with a lot of these positions, Mark, is really talented, but right? Running backs, a lot of talent, but receiver, a lot of talent, but right? Offensive line, a lot of talent, but D-line, same way. Linebacker is going to be the same way. And the secondary is going to be the same way. So there's a lot of potential for the Notre Dame this spring. This team has a chance to be really good. Like, I think this team, if most of the pieces kind of fall into place the way I think so, I truly believe this is going to be Notre Dame's best team of the last 25 years. I think it can be that good. But as you know, and you've been following this a lot longer than I have, we've also seen a lot of these teams that have a lot of potential, but a lot of question marks. They don't get answered the way that you want, and that team doesn't quite live up to its potential. So that's what makes this spring so important, because you've got to take that big first step this spring to start to say, hey, look, we feel good about a lot of these, because I could see this team, being in the playoff again, compete for a championship, and I could see this team go 9-3, because the schedule's tougher. I mean, this year's schedule is going to be much tougher than what Brian Kelly's dealt with the last 5 or 6 years. You think about it, from 15 to 21, Notre Dame won at least 10 games in 6 of those 7 years. 2 of the years that they won 10-plus games, their only win over a ranked team was Navy. I mean, think about that. They went 11-2 in 2019. They went 1-2 against teams that finished the season ranked. So they benefited from playing a softer schedule. Well, you've got Ohio State, Clemson, Lincoln Riley's at USC now. You've got BYU on the schedule. North Carolina, Phil Jerkovic and what they're doing at Boston College and Coach Hafley. Like, this is going to be a tougher schedule than what they've had. So if those questions don't get answered, they just can't go out talent 10, 11 opponents like they have in the past. They can do that to like 9, but those other 3, you're going to have to earn those wins. And that's going to be a little bit of a difference from what we've seen in the past.
Well, Brian, my major take from all that is thanks for reminding me that I've seen a lot more college football than you have.
Well, I've kind of, been in my little Notre Dame world, and, I was coaching for 7 years myself and couldn't watch as much, college football. I had to kind of watch my college football. So
I was taking that from the longevity standpoint.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, even if you're just 5 seasons more, I'm just trying to. You're the voice of college football. I would hope you've seen a lot more, football than I have.
We sure try.
Did I save myself with that last comment?
You did pretty well. Once you throw in the voice of college football, and yeah. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna take that as we slug it out from noon to 2 a.m. every Saturday, watching college football as much as possible. Yeah. All right, Brian Driscoll's here, Irish Breakdown. Let's take it to the second level, and when you take in Drew White and Bertrand and Kaiser and Bauer, there's a lot of production there. Drew White's gone. How does the second level stack up for 22?
It's got to get better. I mean, I think that's the thing, is the production was good, right? Like, Drew White was a productive player for 3 years, and J.D. Bertrand over 100 tackles last year, 7 tackles for loss. Jack Kaiser had 2 huge pick sixes last year, but the production wasn't good enough. It was the tackles for loss numbers were way down compared to what they've been in the past. I mean, they had Drew White the year before had 9 tackles for loss. I think he had 8 the year before that, or vice versa. He might have had 9 in 2019 and then 8 in 2020. It was one of those two. He was down to 4.5 last year. J.D. Bertrand was their leading tackler, but only had 7 tackles for loss. Jack Kaiser wasn't a super disruptive player outside of, the couple big pick sixes. And they were big plays. I mean, the pick six against Wisconsin put that game away. And the pick six he had against Georgia Tech was a real big moment and really burying the Yellow Jackets early in that game. But, there's also a lot of coverage issues. I mean, that was another big thing, is just getting beat up the seams and, the overall lack of length. I mean, Jack Kaiser 6'1", J.D. Bertrand 6 foot, Drew White 6 foot, and none of them are necessarily long. Like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah was only like 6'1", but he was super long, right? Like they didn't have that length, and so against some of the better opponents, they wouldn't have some problems. North Carolina gave them some problems up the seams. USC gave them some problems up the seams. Oklahoma crushed them up the seams. So I think the production is going to have to get a lot better. Now, the good news is as you mentioned, other than Drew White, everybody's back. But they also get Maris Luafau back. He was projected to be their starting will last year. If he comes back, and then you've got Prince Kollie going in his sophomore year, Notre Dame just signed the best linebacker class in the country, in my opinion, as an incoming freshman. They're all early enrollees. All 4 of them are early enrollees, which is huge. You're going to have a longer group. You're going to have a more athletic group. What we don't know is if you're going to have a more productive group. Now, Maris Luafau, to me, is the key to that whole thing, because if he can stay healthy and be what he was before, so my sources close to the team were telling me last summer and early in fall camp that he was by far their best linebacker. And I even had a coach tell me then and remind me again this offseason, he was our best pass rusher last year. Best pass rusher linebacker? No, he was our best pass rusher last year in fall camp. Well, even Foskey, right? Foskey was pretty good, right? But that's how dynamic he was. He's 6'3". He's super fast. We have a guy that I recently hired in January to cover recruiting for us, but he made his living doing NFL draft evaluations, and he's been talking to me about Maris Luafau since the Bama game, about how good this kid is. This kid's super twitchy, super rangy. He's just got to harness it all, right? Like he was played a little bit out of control, and wasn't a super disciplined player from an assignment standpoint, but the tools are there. I mean, he's a kid that it's an interesting one, Mark. He started his career, he was super skinny early in high school, and he played corner. So, but then he kind of started to fill out, and now he's, over 220 pounds, and he can really run. So they need him to emerge, because if he takes hold of that will job and he's like, this is my job, then what that allows Notre Dame to do is then move J.D. Bertrand to Mike, and he can play in that 1-2 punch with Bo Bauer. Because the thing about J.D. is J.D. was a really good player for Notre Dame at times last year, and he was especially good against the run. But he's just not a natural space guy, right? Like, he's a good athlete, but because of the length, he's not a great space guy. And he's kind of a downhill kid, just mentality-wise. He's a downhill guy. His game fits way better at Mike. You can't move him to Mike if Marist isn't ready to go and take hold of that job. But if Marist holds, says, hey, look, this is my job, and then you've got Prince Colley battling it there, you've got the incoming freshman, you're going to feel way more comfortable moving J.D. Bertrand to Mike. Now, J.D. is going to be out most of the spring, so he's not going to get a ton of reps there. So the battle's going to kind of take care of itself as far as the will. You're going to know by the time J.D. gets back in the fall if Marist is ready to take over that will job with Prince Colley as his rotation guy. And if that's the case, now move J.D. to Mike. Now you start kind of saying, okay, now J.D. is going to get more out of his game because he's playing in a better position. You're going to have way more length and speed at will now. Now you start to feel like they at least have the personnel to get the production they need from the second level, because they certainly didn't get it last year. And that's going to be a big part of whether or not this defense is just going to be pretty good like it was last year's. Pretty good defense, right? Look at all the numbers. I mean, top 10 in efficiency and all that. Or are they going to be a defense that's capable of saying, hey, we're championship level defense, right? Like, we're not just really good. We can keep Ohio State in check. We can keep Clemson in check. Right now, they don't have that group, but there's the potential to have that group. And I think Marist Liufau is one of the keys to that.
Brian Driscoll, Irish Breakdown. Got to catch him and his work right there. Again, it's exceptional coverage of college football, so get on over there to Irish Breakdown. DJ Brown picked off 3 passes last year from the corner position as we take it to safety as well. Is Brandon Joseph going to just simply be Kyle Hamilton? Now, we don't know if he's going to replace him in regards to productivity and just the remarkable playmaking ability, but in terms of position, is that just a 1-for-1?
I don't know if that's necessarily going to be the case, because they may move him into the field spot. I think that's kind of be determined. And ideally, they want to get in a situation where the safeties are sort of interchangeable. Kyle a lot last year was sort of that boundary guy, and had to do some things maybe to protect other parts of the defense. But when he went out, he was replaced by Ramon Henderson and Xavier Watts. So I don't know if Brandon's going to slide into the same spot, but he's being asked to step into sort of that playmaking role. And his playmaking is different than Kyle's. They're different athletes, different players. Kyle's a far more dynamic player. Brandon has to get back to being that guy he was in 2020, where he's not an elite athlete. He just was always around the ball in 2020. And he kind of got away from that last year because the rest of the defense around him wasn't that good. I mean, they lost their linebackers. They lost Greg Newsom. They lost a lot of what made that 2020 defense so good. And I think Brandon kind of put a lot more on himself, say, I got to go make these plays. And he would miss tackles that he didn't miss the year before. He was overplaying things, like trying to guess more maybe than he was. I would say is the best way for me to put it, than he was the year before. And he wasn't as an effective player. You transferred to Notre Dame, and now it's like, hey, man, you're back to where you were in 2020, right? You're surrounded by other really good football players. You don't have to do anybody else's job. You got to do your job. And I think that's going to help him get back to be the player. And the biggest thing is you got to tell him, look, Brandon, we're not asking you to be Kyle Hamilton, right? Kyle Hamilton is Kyle Hamilton. We're asking you to be the best version of Brandon Joseph. And if he can be that, I think it really solidifies a position group, because you got to remember, Mark, they played half the year last year without Kyle Hamilton. I mean, he got hurt in the first quarter of the USC game and never came back. So we've seen this defense without Kyle. We've seen the good of parts of what this defense can be without Kyle. Not good, better than what he was, but they're still pretty good. And then we saw like the Oklahoma State game, you're like, boy, they could have really used 14 back there, as DJ Brown and some of those guys were missing tackles and getting beat up the seams and things like that. But you could have released 14 in that game, right? Well, now you've got, Brandon Joseph back there, and you say, hey, hopefully he can kind of fill that void to where when you're in a game against an Oklahoma State or Ohio State and you need a safety to make a play, like we saw Brandon Joseph do against Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game with a crucial interception in the end zone to help keep that game competitive. Well, Notre Dame's going to have a much better offense than what Northwestern put on the field that day, right? And so if your defense can make enough stops, then that's where you say, okay, now you have an opportunity to be competitive in that game where you go into the fourth quarter with a chance to win. Those are going to be the keys. And so he's important to that, because if he can solidify a spot, then you can kind of figure out, okay, who's our next safety, who's going to play beside him, what's the rotation going to look like, are we going to be interchangeable with our guys, or are we going to have to play field boundary? I think it's the other players that are going to largely determine how you use Brandon Joseph. You're going to have to use him as sort of either to protect those other safeties, or if they step up and emerge, and again, the potential turns into production, which is, again, a very key theme with Notre Dame. I understand that. Then you can say, hey, you know what, let's use Brandon all around, because we feel comfortable with, between the combination of Ramon Henderson and Xavier Watts and DJ Brown and Houston Griffith, when he's in the game with so-and-so, we can put him in the field. When he's in the game with such and such, we can put him over here. When this guy's in the game, we can use him this way. And then that way you can use Brandon in his entire package, but you may have to complement him with, depending on what, if you want to use him this way, you may have to put another guy here at safety. If you want to use him this way, you may have to put the other guy at safety. I think that's where you can kind of get into some problems, because if that's the case, eventually your opponents are going to start to see that when they get their game prep. Like, hey, when this guy's in the game, this is how they use Brandon. And when this guy's in the game, this is how they use Brandon. You want to have guys that can come in there and do a little bit of everything, to where Notre Dame can get to be that interchangeable, safety position where it's not just field, not just boundary. One guy's playing over top, one guy's playing the alleys, that kind of thing. And that's, to me, the biggest question mark about this group. And if that pans out, I think it's going to take a lot of pressure off Brandon Joseph, and we're going to see him look a lot more like the 2020 version of himself than what he was in 2021.
So, Brian, transitioning to corner, where do we stand there?
Whew. Well, Cam Hart's out this spring with a shoulder injury.
Okay.
So again, it was something he could have played through. It was either, hey, you rehab it and you play through it, or you just get it cleaned up right after the year. He chose to get it cleaned up right after the year. Same with Jason Adamiola. So he's going to be out, which is, again, not great for him. You'd like to see him get that work in, but Cam Hart was pretty good this year, and so it's about finding that next guy with him, and that's going to be the big question mark. And as we saw against Oklahoma State, Oklahoma State just said, see that number 5, we're not going to worry about him. We're not going to throw at him. We're not going to waste our time, because that guy over there can't cover us. And that's what they did. And we saw that happen with Cincinnati. Wisconsin would have hit a couple big plays against Notre Dame, against Clarence Lewis, if their quarterback could complete a pass beyond 5 yards. Graham Mertz got better as the year went on, but against Notre Dame, he couldn't complete a pass beyond 5 yards. It was bad. And he was missing open guys. And Cincinnati didn't miss those throws. Oklahoma State didn't miss those throws. And that's what got Notre Dame in some trouble. And Sam Howell didn't miss those throws, which is why that was a competitive game for 4 quarters. So, you look at it and say those are good offenses, but none of them are going to be like what they're going to face in the opener against Ohio State. With all due respect to Spencer Sanders and Sam Howell and the receiving corps that they put on the field, Notre Dame's going to not – this is going to be the best offense they're going to face, and will have faced for several years, really. And I know they lost a lot of receivers, but, it's ridiculous about what – the plug and play that Ohio State kind of has a receiver, where they're able to lose Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, and you've got Emeka, Marvin Harrison, you've got obviously Jackson Smith and Jigba's coming back. And then they just signed another great receiver class with Caleb Brown and that group of players, and so Keon Graves, and so they're a machine there right now, and you're going to have you can't just have a second corner opposite Clarence Lewis or Cam Hart. You've got to have a third corner ready to go where you can play nickel. And so it's the biggest question mark. And right now, as you kind of look at the team and evaluate the team, this to me is my biggest concern, because I don't know if we have the answers there. As we as in like observers of Notre Dame, if we have the answers there that you see at other positions. We're like, okay, we don't know if Maris is going to be that guy, but we know that Maris has the tools to be that guy. Riley Mills can be that guy on the offensive line. We know that Lorenzo Styles and Braden Lindsey can be that guy receiver. You know who those guys are. I don't know who those guys are going to be at cornerback. It's a big question mark. And, does Clarence Lewis get a lot better? I don't know. Does Tariq Bracy be a more consistent player? I don't know. Can the sophomores, Ryan Barnes and Philip Riley and Chance Tucker, kind of take a big leap and be able to help you and push for playing time? I don't know. Will the incoming freshmen be able to help you? Jaden Mickey and Benjamin Morrison. I don't know. I don't know if any of those guys are going to be ready. And that's what makes the cornerback position really concerning and really troubling, because as we saw last year, teams can just say, why would you waste your time throwing at Cam Hart? Just don't even waste your time on it. Just go throw with those other guys. And until those guys can make teams pay for it, just what we're going to see teams do. And Ohio, look, because Mark, I mean, can we be honest about this, right? Like Notre Dame's at the point now as a program where you're not worried about beating Navy anymore. You're not worried about being worse than 9-3. Like you're at that point now where you're going to be a 9-3 team minimum, right? You're going to beat 9 teams on your schedule, right? Just because you're just going to out-talent them. That's where they are now. But that's not the standard for Notre Dame. You shouldn't be. And this is what was so frustrating about Brian Kelly is his overall record is this. What has he ever done against anybody good? You know, I mean, he had a below 500 record against teams ranked in the top 15 for his career, right? Like you're evaluating Notre Dame on the standard of can you beat the best teams in the country? And Notre Dame has not proven they can consistently do that. And the only big wins they had, right? If you look at the 2 biggest ones they've had since 2013, they beat Michigan State, who ended up being number 3 in the country and ended up going 13-1. That was a really good Michigan State team. When they beat them, they were unranked. So there wasn't the same pressure on that game. And then they went and beat Clemson a couple years ago. Well, I mean, if we're being honest, as Notre Dame fans, you went to overtime against a team that didn't have Trevor Lawrence, didn't have their best defensive lineman, didn't have 2 of their starting linebackers, and you still needed overtime to beat them. And then when that team was healthy and they played you like 3 weeks later, they curb stomped you, right? So you have to be honest about that and say, those are the games that still have to be determined. So Clarence Lewis can beat 9 of the teams that they're going to play this year. Clarence Lewis and Tariq Bracy and those guys, they're going to be good enough to beat 9 of the opponents. They're going to be good enough to beat BYU. They're going to be good enough to beat North Carolina and Boston College. But that's not the standard. The standard is, are they going to be good enough to help you beat Ohio State and Clemson? And if USC is what the media says USC is going to be this year, I mean, apparently they just had the best practice in the history of football the other day, apparently. Then that's the standard, right? And if you beat the other 9 teams and you go 1-2 against those 3 teams, then it's not good enough. And that's the position group to me that is the biggest concern about whether or not you're going to be able to go 3-0 or 2-1 against those teams and then continue to beat the other people you're supposed to beat.
USC better not roll out the same defense they did in 21, one of the worst 3 in the Pac-12.
And last I checked, they didn't have 5 new transfers along the offensive line either. So, people
forget about the offensive line.
Yeah, I don't think they're playing 7-on-7, right?
field.
I mean, last I checked, it's not a 7-on-7 league, the Pac-12. No. It may look like it sometimes, but it's not a 7-on-7 league last I checked.
I've heard several player personnel directors in the NFL, when asked to project what's going to happen in the coming NFL season, and this is any year, after they look at starting quarterback returning, offensive line.
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan Dorr hit on 16 of 21 kicks. Special teams, any concerns there? How have the coverage units been on punts and kickoffs and return units? Chris Tyree obviously factored in well. Kyron Williams is a loss there in the punt return game.
I'm always worried about kickers and punters. As a former football coach, I'm always worried about kickers and punters. I don't care if they're 4-year starters or not. They're a different breed. I think kicker is an interesting one because they got a kid in from Arkansas State named Blake Rupe. And he's a 5'8", 155-pound kid. And he's basically automatic from 40 yards in. But he's never really kicked a lot of balls outside of 40 yards, So you ask yourself, like, okay, well, what if they need like a 45-yard game winner? Does he take that job too? Does redshirt freshman Josh Bryan kind of take that role? I think, they like his potential, but, he's not ready yet. So they went out and got a grad transfer for competition. They're going to have a new punter this year because Jay Bramlett transferred to LSU. That was the only player that Brian Kelly took with him was their punter. So there was, who's going to go with Brian Kelly to LSU? The punter did. So, there you go. Good job there, Brian Kelly. And so, I mean, that's kind of the concern is like, look, you're going to need, there's going to be a game that's going to come down to a field goal at the end of the game, right? Like, are you going to be able to have a guy that can make that kick? Well, if it's from 35 yards in, I feel pretty good about it based on what Blake Grupe did at Arkansas State. But you and I both know, Mark, that kicking a game winner at Arkansas State's a little different than kicking a game winner in the shoe. You know what I mean? Or at home against Clemson, or out in the Coliseum, or in the college football playoff. You know what I mean? Like, it's a different animal. And how will Blake handle that? We don't know. And I'm always nervous about those players. And now that there's the uncertainty, I'm going to be more nervous. But as far as coverage units, I expect them to be very good. I love the hire of Brian Mason. I mean, his special teams, outside of the place kickers, right? I just said, outside of their place kicking, Cincinnati had phenomenal special teams last year. and he's someone that knows Coach Freeman. They've worked together before. There's a trust there. He kind of knows the energy he brings. And I mean, you just listen to him interview, and he's like, okay, this guy's the stereotypical special teams coach, like just super fired up and super energetic. And it's just like a natural energy, right? It's not like the false enthusiasm of a strength coach. You know what I mean? It's just like, it's just, man, I'm fired up. I'm energetic. I'm high octane. I've drank 75 cups of coffee today. And he brings that kind of energy. And I think they need that. The previous special teams coach was not necessarily the most respected guy on the staff. And I think that there's going to be a re-energized group of, hey, look, we love playing for this guy. This guy's exciting. We trust him. And we're gonna go out there and do what we need to do. And there's certainly a lot of athletes to be good in coverage. They should be good in kick return if they actually let Chris Tyree do it. I think punt return is going to be just find a guy that can fair catch until you find someone who can maybe do something different. I think that's going to be because punt return has changed a lot in recent years with the rugby kicks and all that, where you just don't see the spread punt like you did back in 1988 through 90 when Rocket Ismail was returning kicks, and 80 your guys were 90 your guys at the snap of the punt were retreating, and then you had your two gunners, and if Rocket can make the gunners miss, he was out, and then Notre Dame was so loaded at punt returners in 88 that Rocket Ismail wasn't even their main punt returner. It was Ricky Waters, and so it's just a different era. The rugby punt has really changed things. So I just don't get as worked up about the lack of punt returns as I used to. But so to me, catching it is priority number one. But if you can get a guy back there that can catch it and you trust him, but also a guy that's athletic enough to make a guy miss and do some damage, that only helps you, right? Like, I don't get worked up about not getting returns in the punt game, but it doesn't mean I don't like them or don't appreciate how important they are. If you can, catch a ball at the 30 and just get 15 yards, 15, 20 yards, and all of a sudden you're starting your midfield, that's a big difference. You just got your offense a first down or two. So it plays into the field position battle. But I care more about the guy not letting it roll to the 5 or fumbling it than I do necessarily the guy that gets you that return. That's just kind of my take on it. Until the rules change and, different things like that, if they ever do, and I don't think that they will, because I don't think the NCAA or any level of football has an interest in doing things that create more returns. That's just the nature of it. So I just think you have to be have to adapt to it and say, be more aggressive with your block stuff as opposed to trying to spend too much time on returns. Doesn't mean you don't do returns, but just there's other things to me that are more important than that.
Yeah, it's obviously been minimized in recent years, no question about that. And it's more important, as you mentioned, just secure the football on the offensive side, and in the coverage game, just have a good punter who's going to pin the opponent deep and, tackle